The Ukrainians were stuck in the middle of the battlefield. The M2 Bradley advanced, firing at the positions defended by the Russians, while Sergeant coordinated the armored vehicle and the soldiers around him, issuing orders. They needed to be quick to stop any Russian strategy. All it would take was for an enemy to get up ahead with a rocket-propelled grenade, for the advantage of the armored vehicle to be lost, and for the comrades inside to be burned alive by a more precise and powerful shot. One of the soldiers aimed the PKM at the Russians, who ducked under the Bradley's fire. Loaded with 7.62 ammunition, the weapon roared to death against the enemies, giving hope for the Ukrainians to keep advancing on that difficult day. Half of the year 2023 has passed. Summer lingered and was already starting to look toward the horizon to say goodbye and let autumn arrive. The heat still spread through the heavy air of the battlefield. The hot winds carried the smell of gunpowder, while the men walked through the green fields, with the landscape enhanced by the twisted metal of destroyed vehicles. Every time the Ukrainians passed by the equipment, they were reminded of the men they had lost. They knew that in this summer and spring, what grew as flowers in the fields also appeared as flags over the graves of their fallen brothers. The Ukrainian counteroffensive was moving slowly, with international pressure for them to be as fast as they were in 2022. The last few months showed how haste only benefited the generals sitting on couches, giving their opinions from keyboards or in interviews. The men who fell in the fields were in no hurry to cross mined lands, lose their legs, go home mutilated, or return in coffins to be carried by their families. In Zaporizhia, the Russians had prepared defenses that were too strong. Small villages became large battlefields. The size of a place didn't matter. Strange and remote places had already become crucial in wars. For the soldiers, unfamiliar names like Tokmak, Robotin, Urozin were as important an objective as Kiev. During the months of July and August, many surprises happened involving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ivan Popov, the chief commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army of Russia, stationed in southern Ukraine, let an audio recording leak where he talked about his concerns for the troops fighting without rest and also criticized the Russian strategy on the battlefield. The Major General raised questions about the lack of counter-battery fire, artillery reconnaissance stations, and as a result, this led to the deaths of soldiers from the Russian armed forces, even though the Russians had a total advantage at that moment. The Russian command listened carefully to the criticisms and took action. They dismissed Popov from command and sent him to Syria. The Ukrainians did not stop to celebrate the news that circulated among so many Russian channels. The artillery and defenses continued to cause them death and a sea of difficulties in taking control of the small villages. There were more reasons to celebrate actions such as finally having the ability to strike the Russians in their own territory. The drones cut through wind and sea to reach Russian targets. It was from the sky that they appeared to set planes on fire in places as far as 600 kilometers from Kyiv. At Pskov Airport, Il-76 aircraft lit up the Russian night with flames. At least 2 of these planes were confirmed destroyed and another 4 damaged in the process. The Unit M is not recognized. Could you please provide more context or use a standard unit of measurement? At Tchaikovka Airport also became ruins. Russia lost more than $200 million in these events. Of course, none of this went unscathed. Russia had immense firepower, and therefore Ukraine suffered its worst drone attack since the spring. The deadly weapons flew across the country. Not all of them were shot down, which caused the death of 2 civilians, confirmed after the chaos and fear caused by the falling lethal instruments. The missiles were launched precisely by the 22 supersonic planes. In addition, the Iranian Shahed drones were being replaced by their Russian version, the Geran 2. These machines of death were flying on a one-way path with the sole purpose of destroying. With a length of 3.5 meters, a weight of approximately 200 kilograms, and a wingspan of 2.5 meters, the Shahed reached speeds over 185 kilometers per hour, descending upon Ukrainian targets. Equipment like the S-300 was one of the defenses to intercept the harm caused by these machines. But the Ukrainians still didn't have time to celebrate. They needed to keep going. The only possible strategy was to advance, passing by their vehicle graveyards and adding to the news and to the world map the name of yet another small town that would become the capital of hell for days or weeks. The tanks needed to advance over the Russian defenses before the Russians themselves reinforced the defenses that were behind the first ones. The map was marked with the main lines of protection of the enemies. Complex network that in August had major obstacles. The village of Staromaiorske was one of the objectives in July, back when the surprising events of August would not have been believable if told. The armored vehicles moved through those mined fields, with men watching the evidence of Russian power shattering centimeters of steel. The smoke across the field was frightening, rising majestically amid the sounds of explosions and the crackling of fire. Moving forward was less of an option and much more a duty to the lives of comrades and the sacrifice of the fallen. The 35th Separate Brigade, together with the 7th Separate Battalion, took on the commitment to turn Staromaiorske into the next center of the world. Russian drones filmed the columns of equipment moving over the greenery, trying to escape the mines. The artillery targeted the group that subjected themselves to the dangerous attack, hitting the less fortunate and leaving many of the men in a desperate position in the middle of the field. Under fire, the soldiers saw the explosions continue, closing their eyes as only luck would decide if the next 155mm shell would fall on their heads. Ironically, the only protection was sometimes just the craters from the explosions. They depended on a brave crew to cross that land where the devil had hired the Russians to turn it into a branch of hell. The luckiest managed to leave the place still with the smell of smoke in their nostrils and fear running through their veins. The still intact Max Pro vehicles continued on their way. One of these mine-resistant vehicles could be equipped with an armored machine gun mounted on the roof with a caliber of 0.3 of an inch or half an inch. The Russians hidden in the bushes saw the heavy ammunition hit everything ahead, tearing the green from the trees and the red from the men. When the armored vehicles stopped moving, the soldiers went out into the woods, searching for the Russians in the trenches. The machines beside them provided cover for the large open fields. On the other side, it was just hand-to-hand combat with the enemies hidden among the leaves. The opponent was barely seen among the trees that formed the defenses. Since the artillery hadn't turned the whole place into barren ground yet, the Ukrainians needed to take careful steps to advance. Under the guidance of drones, they tried to reach the holes where the Russians were hiding. Some parts still had trees, but others were just a picture of destruction. Sometimes the men found themselves trapped at certain points, with machine guns preventing their advance. They were lucky when the squad leader could count on a Bradley accompanying them with its 25mm M242 Bushmaster firing at the Russians. That is, when the vehicle was lucky enough not to be hit by any anti-tank guided missile. The Ukrainians' PKMs worked to pin down the Russians even more, who desperately sought cover in the sparse brush around the trench or inside the holes. Unfortunately for the defenders, once the Ukrainians were already inside the defenses, it was hard to maintain cohesion. Many of the Russians tried to escape by running under the cover of vegetation. The drone's gaze was fixed on them, alerting the artillery that no one should get out. The dreams of retreating to safety were turned into smoke, reeking over blood.
Fresh. Maintain.
The captured trenches were not easy either. The Russians had precise knowledge of the locations they were defending. As soon as possible, they started to unleash everything they had. An MTD-12 wrapper was capable of causing serious damage to the entrenched Ukrainians. The soldiers advanced, suspecting that the fire would come soon. One of those pieces of equipment could deliver death directly to them from a distance of 3 kilometers right from the outskirts of Staromaiorske. The Russian drone observed, helping to correct the aim of the vengeance that would fall upon those who had taken the trenches. The Ukrainians kept advancing, working under inevitable pressure. They removed the mines left by the Russians and searched for traps. The artillery started to fall further ahead, with the men noticing that the Russians still hadn't been able to adjust their aim properly. The shots kept getting closer and closer, forcing the Ukrainians to stop.
The next one.
A 100mm shell exploded in front of the soldiers, throwing all the earth from the trench like an avalanche over the men. Buried in a grave dug by gunpowder, the soldier had to contain his terror while the others dug toward him to get him out alive. He came out of that terrifying moment unharmed. The challenge was not over yet. The positions that had been gained needed to be occupied. It was common for less trained troops, sometimes recently mobilized, to be placed in the middle of that chaos. The Russians watched the less experienced Ukrainians being thrown into the meat grinder and turned on the machine to carry out the grinding efficiently. The drones found the Ukrainians and began to fill the officers' lists with farewell letters. The entry into Staromaiorske was no less painful. The Russian artillery was efficient at destroying any type of armored vehicle that had been supplied to the Ukrainians. The Turkish vehicles, Kerp and Kazakh too, were turned into a pile of twisted metal right at the entrance to the city. The arrival was difficult for the Ukrainians. Their armored vehicles were quickly detected by the Russians. Sometimes they reached the first houses, but their visit was brutally interrupted by the hosts. The soldiers kept advancing. Any chance to get closer also created opportunities for attack. The Russian trenches taken near the city were used by the Ukrainians to fire their RPGs and then run for cover. Little by little, the resistance was overcome. The men entered Mayorsk searching for Russians hiding among the houses. The enemy could be anywhere. That's why it was necessary to fire into every possible hiding place to finally break the resistance. The Russians saw those advances and took their revenge in the same way. The bombings destroyed what was left of the houses. They couldn't let the Ukrainians settle in the region, or let them get too close to other important positions. Even so, by the end of July 2023, the small city was taken and the Ukrainian flag was raised by the soldiers. Being at Mayorsk would still be a reason for dispute and a grave for both Russians and Ukrainians. The days of fighting over villages until then unknown to the world did not end. If the names of the places might be recorded in history, the names of the soldiers who died for their countries in this conflict might not receive the same attention, becoming just a memory in a picture frame or on a grave and an eternal sorrow in the hearts of their relatives. What history books do not record forever often does not have the same meaning and value as the memory kept in the longing of the heart.